So let's discuss a quick basic overview how the New Testament was written, and we'll get into more details soon. Jesus taught his 12 disciples intensely for 3 years, along with teaching some other disciples and crowds of people, and then he was killed and rose from the dead. Less than 2 months later, the church was started during the events of Pentecost. The apostles were teaching weekly in Jerusalem for a few months, and there was a first round of persecution that scattered many Christians out of Jerusalem. Then things settled down for about 10 years after Paul was converted. For these first few years after Jesus' resurrection, everyone thought Jesus was coming back any minute, so most of the apostles' teaching was not written down, just preached and discussed each week and then learned orally. And around 44 AD, the apostle James was killed by the King Herod, and Peter was imprisoned and then escaped from the prison and went away, probably to Rome, and Mark went with him as his interpreter and assistant. At that time, people started writing down accounts of Jesus' life and teachings based on his disciples' teaching, since they realized that Jesus had not yet returned and his disciples were starting to die, and they did not want to lose the words of Jesus' teachings from his disciples. Now, Paul, also called Saul, and Barnabas took their first missionary journey around 46 or 47 AD. Then there was a big controversy about whether circumcision was necessary for Gentile converts, and the first Jerusalem council was convened around 49 or 50 AD, so Peter and Paul and all the leaders of the church met in Jerusalem for that. Afterward, Paul and Silas took their second missionary journey and spread the information about Jesus throughout many cities of Asia Minor and Greece. Matthew and Mark were probably written in the 40s or 50s, and Luke around 60 AD, and most of the other New Testament books were written in the 50s and 60s. Jesus' brother James was martyred in Jerusalem around 62 AD. Importantly, none of the books mention the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. When that event happened, the last disciples were scattered out of Jerusalem, and other cities such as Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria became more prominent centers of Christianity. Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome under Emperor Nero, somewhere between 64 and 68 AD, and the Apostle John went to live in Ephesus for a while, where he taught disciples like Polycarp and Ignatius. These men who knew John, such as Papias and John's disciples Polycarp and Ignatius, and also Clement, who knew Peter in Rome, these later wrote down quotations from the New Testament books, and Papias wrote down the story of how Matthew and Mark had been written. The background knowledge about the date and authorship of the writing of the Gospels was passed down from teacher to pupil. One of the most notable chain of teachers to student was from John the disciple of Jesus to John's disciple Polycarp to Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus, who wrote a lot of this down in his works. There were a lot of other early Christians who also wrote lengthy works in the 2nd century. For example, Origen and Tertullian, Hippolytus, and others. They quoted a lot from the New Testament documents. Origen was a scholar from Alexandria originally, who traveled a lot and read a lot and wrote many books of his own, including some rather heretical views. When he died, he left his large library to Pamphilus, who started the theological library at Caesarea, and later Pamphilus' student Eusebius became the bishop or Christian leader of that city, Caesarea. The library at Caesarea had more than 30,000 manuscripts, including biblical manuscript copies from many different parts of the Roman Empire. After the Emperor Constantine made Christianity a legal religion in 315 AD, Eusebius researched and wrote down the first complete history of the church, quoting a lot of the primary source documents from the manuscripts he had available to him in the Caesarea library. Meanwhile, the disciples were copying the New Testament documents on papyrus and occasionally parchment. And we have the earliest surviving fragments from scrolls and codices for John and Matthew from the 2nd century, and Luke and Mark from the 3rd century. And then we have a complete parchment manuscripts of the whole New Testament and most of the Old Testament as well from the early 4th century that have survived until today. For example, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and so on from the 4th century. And this 100-year gap between the writing of the documents and the earliest manuscripts or fragments is a shorter gap than for most other ancient authors. Most ancient works are lost or incomplete, but scholars still assume that we have a reasonably accurate copy, even when the earliest manuscripts is hundreds of years after the original writing, because the standard assumption is that there were written manuscripts during that time, but the manuscripts have simply not survived to the present time. There were huge ancient libraries in cities such as Alexandria, Caesarea, Rome, Herculaneum, and others, which had tens of thousands of scrolls and books, but those libraries have been looted or destroyed over the centuries, or in the case of Herculaneum, destroyed by a volcanic eruption, so we just don't have a lot of these documents available to us today. So, in summary, the New Testament documents have very strong evidence supporting their reliable transmission from their writing in the first century until today.